Okay, go now.
Are we ready? Okay, thank you and welcome everybody to the continuation of the hearing on the proposed merger between Kansas City Southern and Canadian Pacific, docket number 36500. I will say in general, we appreciate everyone's patience in staying with us through these hearings, which of course have extended longer than we scheduled them for initially, largely because of board questions and witness answers. With that, we have, I think, sent out on Friday the schedule of appearances for today and tomorrow, so everybody should have a program, and we are ready to begin. So with that, we will call the first witness, Mayor Friday Ellis of Monroe, Louisiana. And Mr. Mayor, he's not available. Okay. I thought he would be available today. Well, hopefully he can testify tomorrow. So that would take us to the next witness, Heather Stebbings, and I see her, Executive Director of Pacific Northwest Waterways. So, Ms. Stebbings, you're on.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, good afternoon. It's good morning out here on the West Coast, but thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Heather Stebbings, and I'm the Executive Director of the Pacific Northwest Waterways Association. And we are a trade group representing 150 member organizations in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Our members are the ports, farmers, shippers, and others that support efficient movement of cargo and people in and out of the Pacific Northwest. Our organization is opposed to the merger between the Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern railroads. We believe that it will result in a shift of cargo, shipping capacity, and export opportunities from regions currently served by U.S. West Coast ports to Canada and Mexico, and would cause economic harm to our regional and national economies. Over the last 15 years, the government of Canada has made it a top national priority to make significant coordinated investments in its West Coast ports and the multimodal infrastructure that supports them. These investments have supported the capture of cargo market share from U.S. ports. In 2007, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma handled 61% of the containerized cargo imported through northwestern North America. By 2021, that share had dropped to 44%. While ports in Western Canada handled 56%. In addition to diverting cargo to Canada from Northwest U.S. ports, the applicants have made clear their intention to increase cargo throughput from Mexican ports served by Kansas City Southern's rail assets, cargo that otherwise would be handled by ports on the U.S. West Coast. When U.S. ports lose cargo, we lose the jobs involved in handling that cargo. We estimate the diversion of cargo from Puget Sound to Canadian ports from 2007 onward represents a loss of at least $15 billion in revenue to the Washington state economy and at least 72,000 job years lost. Cargo diversion from Northwest ports to those in Canada also has reduced ocean carrier calls and, importantly, the supply of returning empty containers that our exporters depend on. This in turn increases shipping costs and erodes or eliminates the competitiveness of exports from states that depend on us as their primary international trade gateways. Canadian and Mexican ports are not viable alternatives for exporters in Idaho, Montana, Washington, and many other parts of the country. These shippers have little recourse when ocean carriers reduce service to West Coast ports. It is important to note that a key factor in the success of the ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert has been the substantial financial support they have received from their federal government. For example, from 2016 to 2020, Canadian federal contributions to projects at British Columbia ports totaled $372 million, compared to $45 million for Washington state ports and $179 million for the ports in California. And California and Washington together have 30 ports handling substantial cargo volumes, compared with only 4 in British Columbia. Canadian federal contributions in their trade gateways have been mirrored by federal investments along the entire trade corridor that connects the ports to population centers in the North American heartland. When it comes to investments in our supply chain, Canada is simply outspending us. The strategies, investments, and other actions supporting the growth of Canadian ports and rail networks are commendable and offer examples the U.S. should consider implementing. Our concern is that the U.S. federal government has enabled their success by failing to respond to Canada's efforts to build more competitive trade routes and capture market share from U.S. ports and railroads. The primary shortcoming of U.S. policy has been a lack of overarching strategy, and corresponding investment in freight infrastructure relative to what the Canadian government has been spending. Regulatory and policy issues have also posed a challenge for our competitiveness. The merger would greatly expand the trade corridors that connect non-US ports to inland regions within the US. It would be a significant milestone in a series of steps taken by public and private entities in Canada that has resulted in increased cargo flows and shipping services through Canada at the expense of our US gateways. An approval of the merger would be another example of the US government not taking seriously enough the competitive threat to our ports, and with the loss of cargo, ship calls, and ultimately the loss of key trade routes means to the national and local economies. Instead of outsourcing our infrastructure, supply chains, and trade routes to other nations, the US should instead invest in US-based transportation infrastructure and make America's own gateways and trade corridors more efficient and competitive. Ultimately, a decision to approve the merger would result in job losses and other economic harm to the nation, and it is on these grounds that we urge the STB to reject the merger. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide comment today, and I'd welcome any questions.
Do any board members have any questions for Ms. Stebbings? I have one, Ms. Stebbings. I'm sure you're aware that in the most recent congressional appropriations in this area, money has been designated to be able to be used to invest in our ports. And I'm wondering why the appropriate response, if this merger were to be approved for all the organizations you represent, as well as all of us who are concerned about the issues you raised, is to make our ports more competitive and obtain the investments that are needed rather than try to limit somebody else's development.
We have been very appreciative of the dollars that have been expended to date and that are anticipated to be coming to ports and other entities for sure. But the issue is that Canada has been outspending us for 15 plus years. And so we're behind the curve, and it continues to be a problem, especially when we look at things like the regulatory process and getting projects completed in a timely fashion. They've just outspent us over the last number of years, and we'd be playing a game of catch up. That's what we're doing.
By the way, as I understand it, it's not only been the Canadian government, but the railroads, particularly in Port Rupert, CP has made some substantial investments, I think. So I don't think it's only the government that may not be living up to its share, but railroad investment, well, particularly in intermodal. It's been a concern I've raised over the last year. So I think we have to look at both. But I do appreciate your remarks and you're taking time to testify to us.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, I think I misspoke, by the way. I think it's CP as at the other port and CN's at Port Rupert, but the railroads have been making some of those investments. Any others have questions for Ms. Stebbings? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next is Jackie Bauman, Chief Engineer of the City of Gonzales, Louisiana.
Good evening. Let's see. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
You are. Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. My name is Jackie Bowman. I'm the city engineer in Gonzales. Gonzales is located between Baton Rouge and New Orleans in southern Louisiana. I am here to speak on behalf of the mayor, city council, and all of the population here in Gonzales in support of this merger. The city of Gonzales has been focused on transportation-oriented development for many, many years. And we see this merger as an opportunity to reinvest in passenger rail, which our community desperately needs. As you may know, South Louisiana is plagued with natural disasters, and the railroad is an avenue that we can use to evacuate people. We additionally have a disadvantaged population of elderly community trying to reach the medical district in Baton Rouge. We see passenger rail as another way to move people to the resources that they need to get to and are unable to get to today. And I will close in saying the city is here in support of passenger rail and this merger, not just vocally, but we have, as a city, invested in acquisition of property near the previous passenger rail depot, should it be reopened. We've also applied for and received an award letter for a RAISE grant, where the city would be putting up matching funds to help build station infrastructure. So I just wanted to speak on behalf of this merger and support that effort.
All right. Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Ms. Baumann? Thank you, Ms. Baumann. Appreciate your making the effort to testify to us. Next is, I'm not sure the pronunciation, Amy Cook, former Majority Leader of the Minnesota State Senate.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm here to express my concerns about the proposed merger between CP and KCS. Communities across my home state of Minnesota are already impacted by high costs, environmental factors, and long waits for train crossings, and this mega merger will unfortunately make things worse. For starters, the increased rail traffic this merger would cause will bring more crude oil through Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other smaller communities throughout our state, especially as the Biden administration seeks to limit the number of new pipelines for oil and gas transport, given the recently averted rail strike and the havoc this would have wreaked on energy supplies in the United States. If we're even more reliant on rail transportation for energy resources, this is unwise. CP is already the largest rail shipper of oil through Minnesota, and now this merger will increase that yield, with as many as 20 more trains hauling crude oil by our homes and near our schools each month. Additionally, the merger will result in increased train traffic of other items, including hazardous chemicals. This drastic increase of train traffic carrying hazardous materials would result in more deadly accidents, as evidenced by the study from the Fraser Institute that found that rail is 4.5 times more likely to experience an accident transporting fuels than pipelines. Another consideration is the negative impact this merger would have for Minnesota farmers. Increased demand for fuel shipments, which command higher shipping rates than farm goods, would displace ag products and make it more difficult to get food to market, raising the already skyrocketing price of groceries. As the administration looks to reduce inflation, it would be unwise to introduce further uncertainty into that supply chain. A U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transpo recently found that busy at-grade train crossings have significant impact on the quality of life in a community and can hinder the first responders' timely access to emergency services. Last week, this board heard from Hennepin County and the city of Mahnomen in Minnesota. But in a Minnesota town like Winona, where train crossing wait times are already a problem with 40-minute delays in some cases, the 50% increase in train traffic this community is expected to see would be disastrous. The real-life devastating consequences of such delays were recently on display in Lockland, Ohio, where a home just 300 feet from the rails was sat in flames for 8 times longer than it should have due to a train that was blocking firefighters from getting to the scene. A 59-second response time became 8 minutes, with flames doubling with each passing minute. There are 35 segments in the U.S. network where this transaction would result in traffic levels that would exceed your STB's Office of Environmental Analysis own safe thresholds, and are 26 locations that require construction. All this rail through populated communities would generate more traffic, more delays, and more opportunities for accidents. CP pledged as part of this merger that they would run shorter trains to cause less delay and promised no trains longer than 7,100 feet. But the reality is that their trains are significantly longer on average. In the third quarter of 2021, CP's average train length was 8,285 feet, or 1.5 miles long. And the railroad regularly ran trains that reached or exceeded 12,000 feet, or over 2.25 miles. There are many adverse impacts to railside communities that have yet to be acknowledged to date and are still unclear even after the release of the draft EIS. There also appears to be minimal potential benefits for the community members. This merger will not bring more affordable oil. It will not benefit Midwest farmers that rely on trains for transporting their products. And it will certainly not benefit the families that will breathe in more pollutants from increased rail traffic or deal with oil spills in their community. It will slow down emergency response times and will create traffic and, as a result, wear and tear on the roadways. I hope that the Surface Transportation Board will take all of these concerns under advisement when making a final decision with regards to this merger. Thank you for your consideration and your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony, Ms. Cook. Is it Cook or how do you
Coke.
pronounce
Thank you,
it?
Mr.
Coke.
Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Like the
Oh.
trucking, but no relation.
Okay. Well, I have a very good friend in Chicago with the same spelling who pronounces it Koch. So it's
Yes.
all, there are many.
There's many.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, next is Dan Borgen, Chairman and President of the USD Group.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, other members. I'm Dan Borgen, Chairman, CEO, and President of US-based US Development Group and subsidiary entities. They are privately owned. USD is the general partner and majority owner of USD Partners, a New York Stock Exchange listed publicly traded partnership formed by USD to acquire, develop, and operate primarily rail-centric midstream infrastructure and complementary logistics solutions for crude oil, biofuels, and other energy-related products. For purposes of these comments, I will use USD, our, and we generically for the USD, USDP, and affiliated companies individually and or collectively and appropriate for the specific statement made. Since its inception, USD has worked to deliver sustainable rail-centric industry solutions that result in superior impacts on people, society, and the environment compared to available alternatives. We strive to proactively solve the strategic needs of our customers and partners, creating flexible market access for customers in significant North American growth areas and key demand centers, including without limitation, Western Canada, the US Gulf Coast, and Mexico. In doing so, we've developed strong working relationships with most, if not all, of the Class 1 railroads based on delivering projects on time and on budget that create value to the railroads and our customers. We and our primary contractors have an outstanding record for safety and environmental compliance that we have accomplished through a lot of hard work and by making them a priority focus. Our operations include rail car loading and unloading, storage and blending in on-site tanks, inbound and outbound pipeline connectivity, truck transloading, as well as other related logistics services. We have built and are operated unit train capable origination and destination terminals with an aggregate capacity, of over 1 million barrels per day, and have safely handled over 420 million barrels of biofuels and liquid hydrocarbons from January 2006 through June 2022. Among our other projects, USD recently commenced operation of a first of its kind DRUbit by rail network. The DBR network begins with a diluent recovery unit, or DRU, in Canada, which allows for the safe, environmentally friendly, and cost competitive shipment of a special blend of Canadian heavy crude oil called DRUbit to the US Gulf Coast. USD also recently commenced operations at a newly constructed DRUbit receiving, blending, and product shipping terminal in Port Arthur, Texas. Key aspects of DRUbit are its sustainability story. DRUbit allows heavy Canadian oil to ship non-hazardous and non-flammable by rail. Compared to current Canadian heavy oil shipment alternatives from Hardisty, Alberta, to the US Gulf Coast, DRUbit is cost competitive and has significantly lower carbon intensity per delivered heavy oil barrel than current pipeline and rail alternatives. DRUbit allows custom blending to customer specifications at destination. Both ends of our DRUbit by rail network are capable of significant expansion. We are working hard to commercialize subsequent phases of expansion. Both CP and KCS, as providing carriers, have been integral to the successful launch of DRUbit. USD supports approval of the CP KCS merger. The transaction will provide benefits that we are eager to see realized. The combined CP KC network with new single line hauls and access to premier ports on the US Gulf Coast, Atlantic, and Pacific Coast, as well as to key overseas markets, will help us and our customers reach existing and new markets more efficiently. As just one example, we believe the merger will provide improved rail efficiency and economics necessary to support further investment in our DBR network, encouraging growth in the use of DRUbit, a more sustainable heavy Canadian crude oil product previously mentioned. This should enable Canadian heavy crude currently shipped by pipeline and rail in diluted form to be converted to DRUbit, a non-hazardous, non-flammable product. With the two railroads' strong focus on safety and their track record of operational excellence, I expect that CPKC will be able to integrate their operations quickly and efficiently to the benefit of both rail customers and other stakeholders. As previously stated, USD has long enjoyed good relationships with many railroads, including a proven trusted relationship with Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern, providing our customer services that often involve rail solutions for various commodities across North America. These services require close operational collaboration and our negotiations with rail carriers. USD believes a CP-KCS combination will create a transcontinental railroad with the scale and reach to deliver improved levels of service that will enable us, USD, and those we work with to better serve our customers and communities. This merger will create the first North American railroad connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico with a single operator. We anticipate that this will expand access to growing markets across the United States, Mexico, and Canada under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement and provide a rail option that uniquely meets the intent of the USMCA. From our perspective, the transaction promises to provide improved service options and invigorate transportation competition in the markets we serve. Our experience shows us that single line rail service options are superior as a transaction will be expected to yield efficiencies in terms of equipment utilizations to the benefit of shippers who use private rail equipment. The merger should improve transit times, reliability, and efficiencies for our customers. This should strengthen competition against the other larger rail carriers, pipelines, and trucks that serve our markets. CP and KCS have had a cooperative relationship in the past, and CP-KCS joint routes are among our transportation options today. Given that a significant component of the supply chain is railroad transportation, we believe that this merger will improve our transportation options and allow opportunities to work closely with CP-KC to create more sustainable alternatives than working individually with CP and KCS. We have long been aware of the attention of CP and KCS to safety and operational effectiveness. Given the straightforward network connectivity between CP and KCS and the fact that CP and KCS are the two smallest U.S. Class I railroads, we are confident that they will be able to implement their transaction without the service disruptions that have accompanied some past rail mergers. For these reasons and others, USD is voicing its support for the combination of CP and KCS because it will enhance competition, provide expanded options, and drive efficiencies for customers of all sizes. USD urges the STB to approve CP's acquisition of KCS as swiftly as possible so that these systems can be integrated and the end-to-end benefits of this merger can be realized for the benefit of USD customers and similarly situated shippers and many public stakeholders, which we are eager to see. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak and voicing our support for this transaction.
Thank you much, Mr. Borgen. Any questions for Mr. Borgen? Okay, thank you much.
Thank you.
Next witness is David Trent of Canadian Forest Products. Mr. Trent.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, Chairman Oberman and members of the board, and thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. My name is David Trent, and I'm here representing Canfor today. Canfor is a large forest products producer headquartered in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, with operations in Western Canada and the Southern US. We produce lumber, pulp and paper, and energy products. As you're keenly aware, in the lumber business and pulp and paper business, competitive rail delivery is an important part of our business. Our lumber rail shipment volumes to the US are approximately 15,000 cars annually today, and CP represents approximately 20% of that volume. We have two locations that are directly served by Canadian Pacific, and we have experienced reliable service at these locations. KCS provides a very efficient routing in terms of cost and transit to Texas, one of our largest worldwide markets. We currently do not utilize this efficient routing due to lack of receivers on the KCS. Most lumber receivers are on either the Union Pacific or BNSF railways. The CP Rail and KCS networks, if combined, will provide for a single network to reach competitively our key markets in the southern US and specifically to Texas. Canfor's present shipment volumes are expected to remain unaffected by the potential CP-KCS network without further development of KCS receivers. While we remain neutral on the proposed merger, we certainly welcome alternative, direct, efficient, and competitive routings to our largest market area. With further development of KCS and CP opportunities in Texas, we certainly could see much improved and competitive enhancement and access to a key market for us. For these reasons, we're certainly not opposed to the merger and would welcome future competitive opportunities for our rail lanes. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and certainly happy to take any questions you or any other member of the board may have.
Thank you, Mr. Trent. Any questions for Mr. Trent? Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Next up, Knox Ross of the Southern Rail Commission. Mr. Ross,
Hello, Mr. Chairman.
how are you, sir?
I am great. Thank you for the time. I'm Knox Ross, the chairman of the Southern Rail Commission. Commission is a three-state compact of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana authorized by Congress. We have worked extensively with host railroads, Amtrak, FRA, and our state partners in working to bring new and improved passenger rail service to our states. It is in this capacity I address you today in support of the merger between Kansas City Southern and Canadian Pacific. The Commission's principal focus is the provision of robust, reliable passenger service to our citizens. To that end, we have three ongoing projects that are directly impacted by this merger. Those are service between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, an extension of the existing Amtrak Crescent service from Meridian, Mississippi to Dallas-Fort Worth, and studying service from Baton Rouge to Shreveport, Louisiana, to connect these two services if they're implemented. After a part of the merger proposal presented to the STB, Canadian Pacific and Amtrak, in a joint filing committed to running one passenger train a day with the consideration of more after safety and capacity upgrades and the study of what is necessary to implement service between Meridian and Dallas-Fort Worth with a specific timeline for implementation of service once agreed upon necessary improvements are made. This is a radical departure of our previous host railroad relationships, and we have welcomed the open cooperation of Canadian Pacific in our planning efforts. Canadian Pacific coordinated with Amtrak an inspection train of the Baton Rouge, New Orleans route and has been fully cooperative with Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development in working toward an initial engineering study to determine what improvements need to be made. CP representatives attended meetings with key decision makers in Washington, D.C. as a part of our successful effort to obtain RAISE grant funding for proposed stations in Gonzales and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. CP has always been extremely helpful in other projects, such as a proposed grade crossing separation project in Rankin County, Mississippi on the I-20 corridor. We both recognize that a successful passenger rail operation must complement and enhance, where possible, the provision of a robust and reliable freight service. We have a commission have long held that passenger service must work for both Amtrak and the host railroad. Our positive cooperative relationship with Canadian Pacific has thus far proved that it is possible to have both. Canadian Pacific maintains an A+ rating with Amtrak on its current services, and we expect through best efforts on both parts that we can expect the same on the services that we intend to provide. We are also interested in providing passenger service where it has a high likelihood of success. In numerous polls and studies on the Baton Rouge, New Orleans corridor, widespread public and business support has been noted. Most significantly, the cities of Gonzales and Baton Rouge have committed significant local investment to match recently awarded RAISE grants to construct stations. And the Louis Armstrong Airport is actively studying construction of a stop on the route as well, making the service a true multimodal service. On the I-20 corridor, a previous Amtrak study showed that the proposed service would generate significant ridership and revenue and would greatly improve the financial performance of the Crescent service south of Atlanta, connecting the great regional hubs of Atlanta and Dallas-Fort Worth. This train would also connect the Evers-Jackson International Airport to our Mississippi and Louisiana cities, many of which are battling to maintain limited air transportation service. Our universities, such as Jackson State, Louisiana Monroe, and Louisiana Tech, see this as a great opportunity to open their campuses to a whole new world of potential students. In previous filings with the Surface Transportation Board, you have seen that cities, counties, parishes, and economic interests along the I-20 corridor have issued enthusiastic resolutions of support for the merger. They see not only the economic advantages of a more robust connected freight system, but they also see the economic opportunity of bringing a new way of travel between our cities and creating a direct connection to the rest of the country for commerce, education, and tourism. They see this as an opportunity to participate in the national economy, to compete more effectively, and to make their quality of life better for their residents, as well as move citizens out of harm's way in the event of a natural disaster, such as a hurricane. In summary, we support the merger of Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern because it gives our states the best opportunity to preserve and enhance their existing freight rail networks. And it also gives us the best opportunity to provide new, robust passenger service to areas which desire it and in which it has a high likelihood of success. The Commission strongly supports the merger application and encourages the STB to approve the proposal. Thank you all for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Ross.
Thank you.
Appreciate your participation, and of course, you're no stranger to our other case.
Right.
We won't talk about today, but we appreciate all the effort you and the commission put on passing.
Mr. Chairman, if you would give me just 30 seconds, I wanted to mention that you all have spent a lot of time during these hearings talking about foreclosure and access. One of the things that we've experienced in Mississippi over the last 40 years or so, probably since the early 70s, is a great deal of foreclosure and lack of access. And I really appreciate the board looking at that very closely, because we've got lines that right now the state is trying to find ways to rebuild that really have been eliminated because of paper barriers mostly. And we appreciate very much you all looking at that closely.
Thank you. It is something we are concerned about, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else have questions for Mr. Ross? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Sean Keenan of the supply chain of SSAB American. Mr. Keenan.
Afternoon. I apologize after test. Oh, there we are. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today in support of the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern combination. My name is Sean Keenan, and I'm Vice President Supply Chain for SSAB Americas. SSAB is a market-leading North American producer of quality steel plate and coil with 2 primary production facilities and 3 downstream processing units. Our plate mills are located in Montpelier, Iowa, and Mobile, Alabama. Our cut-to-length processing facilities are located in Toronto, Ontario, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Houston, Texas. SSAB Americas is the most geographically diverse plate producer in the United States and is the largest producer and supplier of heavy plate in North America, with a market share in excess of 30% in 2021. In 2021, we shipped 2.4 million short tons of finished steel. SSAB maintains a strong market position in the energy market, especially wind, as well as heavy transport customer segments. Our customers are located primarily in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. SSAB ships steel in various railroad supplied rail cars and in private leased cars. The CP-KCS combination will extend CP's reliable service to new single line options in North America, thereby reducing the cycle time of these rail cars and allowing for more efficient use of all equipment. Elimination of 1 day of transit time is estimated to increase the availability and utilization of both railroad supplied and leased cars by 8 to 10%. Reduction of cycle times will increase the level and quality of service we provide to our customers and will allow for the opportunity of increased volume of steel to be shipped by rail. Ultimately, this will lower our dependency on trucks and reduce our carbon footprint. As an example, converting truck to rail on just one rail shipment from Montpelier, Iowa to Kansas City, Missouri would take 4 trucks off the road and lead to reductions in our Scope 3 emissions. SSAB Americas currently has the lowest carbon Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions intensity of any steel producer in North America and has a goal to largely eliminate CO2 emissions by 2030. SSAB produces steel by recycling scrap in 2 electric arc furnaces, and over 70% of our raw material is recycled scrap metal, shipped to our facilities by rail and truck. Improving the cycle times on these moves and expanding the regions from which material can be cost competitively sourced by rail would further allow SSAB to reduce their use of trucks, which will in turn lower our carbon footprint even further. CP Rail has demonstrated significant leadership and sustainability in the North American rail industry. Their commitment to join the UN Global Compact and their leadership role in developing innovative locomotives that can utilize clean fuel alternatives align closely with SSAB's environmental and sustainability goals. The combination of CP and KCS would further the opportunity for SSAB to utilize CP Rail for single line hauls with a fleet of locomotives that will increasingly consume clean burning hydrogen or other alternative fuels, reducing the Scope 3 emissions associated with the shipment of our raw material and finished goods. Beyond the significant environmental opportunities, the CP-KCS combination will provide to SSAB. SSAB is looking forward to extending our market reach via new efficient direct line haul moves into Texas and Mexico. These market regions are important destinations for SSAB as we have both a significant customer base, as well as one of our processing facilities located in these areas. The ability to ship in a more cost-effective manner on a single line haul will increase our competitiveness against both domestic producers as well as import options. In conclusion, SSAB Americas supports the CP-KCS combination because it will allow a more efficient use of rail assets and therefore reduce our dependence on truck and also improve our access to key markets. We therefore respectfully urge the board to approve the combination as quickly as possible. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak in support of the CP-KCS combination. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Keenan. Are there any questions for Mr. Keenan? All right, sir. Thank you. Appreciate your input. Our next witness is Mark Hovland of the North Dakota Grain Dealers Association. Mr. Hovland.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Oberman and members of the board for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I am Mark Hovland. I'm a past president and current director on the North Dakota Grain Dealers Association and general manager of Pheasant & Co-op. The North Dakota Grain Dealers is an association of over 120 companies that operate 250 grain elevators in North Dakota. Pheasant & Co-op is a farmer-owned and operated local co-op in central North Dakota, and we have shuttle loading facilities on the CP and the BNSF, 2 on the CP and 1 on the BN. And we are also served by a short line, the Red River Valley and Western at 4 of our locations. Pheasant & Co-op also has an edible bean division that processes primarily pinto and black beans, with most of those being shipped to various canners and packagers throughout the US. as well as some being exported to Mexico. And there again, we have one location on the BN and one on the CP. North Dakota is a captive rail state with more than 80% of North Dakota's grain shipments occurring by rail. Grain production is the backbone of North Dakota's economy, and efficient and competitive rail service is essential to move grain from points of production to points of consumption. From our perspective, a CP-KCS combination would hold the promise of new market options and open some new markets to North Dakota shippers. We believe that this merger would be a complement to each of the carriers' existing service and support it for that reason. This deal works because there are few overlaps in each carrier's prospective networks and creates new access to North Dakota grain shippers to ports in the US Gulf, Atlantic, and Pacific coasts, as well as Mexico. North Dakota, being a captive rail state, is beholden to the two Class 1 carriers that service it. Freight rates in North Dakota are some of the highest in the country when compared to similar hauls out of states with more freight options. We feel this action will strengthen competition between those carriers, which will improve the economic condition for all North Dakota rail shippers, regardless of what carrier they are on. The North Dakota Grain Dealers Association and Pheasant Co-op is voicing support for the combination of CP and KCS because it should enhance competition and provide more options for our North Dakota grain shippers. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you, sir. Are there any questions for Mr. Hovland?
I have one.
Yes.
Thank you for being here. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what those additional options mean for you all from a business perspective, whether they might manifest themselves in the rates you pay or the service you receive.
Probably both rates and I think anytime you have a direct route somewhere and you eliminate interchange, another railroad perhaps, it should simplify things and hopefully save you some time and costs.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Howland? All right. Thank you, Mr. Howland. Appreciate your participation.
Thanks.
Okay, and we will now move to witnesses who are on a panel, but I'm not sure if we're virtual, we have to treat you that way. First is, just go individually, Jeff Moreno, speaking for the Joint Association, which consists of the American Chemistry Council, the Fertilizer Institute, and NITLIC. Jeff.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I also have my exhibit showing up on my screen. I hope you can see. As you just mentioned, I'm testifying on behalf of ACC, TFI, and the NIT League. And the joint associations have requested conditions to address 3 merger-related concerns. Our first and foremost concern is the ability of the merged CP-KCS to foreclose competition through the extension of bottleneck segments. I'll focus my testimony today on cross-border movements between KCS locations in the US and CP locations in Canada. Such moves are most at risk of competitive harm due to the extensive overlapping networks of CP and CN and the existence of interswitching in Canada. Our competitive concerns, however, are not restricted to just these types of cross-border moves. I have put on your screen a diagram to illustrate our concerns. All moves between KCS locations and Canada are interline moves today. KCS, as you can see, is neutral as to whether it interlines with CP or CN. And note that KCS interchanges with CP and CN at different locations. They do not interchange at the same location. Post-merger, most such moves with interline moves could be converted to single-line CP routes. The existing neutrality of KCS would be destroyed. Applicants have cited to the board's so-called one lump precedents to argue that bottlenecks are not anti-competitive. That precedent relies upon economic thinking from the 1980s and 90s that vertical combinations will not have anti-competitive consequences because the pre-merger bottleneck carrier already was in a position to capture the entire monopoly profit. While acknowledging that this was not an absolute truism, the board's precedent established a presumption in favor of the applicants that shifted the burden of proof. There are several independent reasons why the board should reject applicants' reliance upon the one lump presumption in this transaction. First, UP and BNSF have presented extensive economic testimony to demonstrate a shift in economic thinking since the board last applied the one lump theory over 2 decades ago. Most notably, they demonstrate that the potential for competitive harm from vertical combinations is broader or greater than originally touted. Second, in addition to the economic testimony from UP and BNSF, the Joint Association's comments demonstrate that it is unrealistic and impractical to require carload shippers to rebut the one lump presumption for each individual movement. The one lump precedent was established in the context of unit train movements. Unlike unit train shippers who move high volumes over a few lanes and often just a single lane over the course of decades, carload shippers have hundreds of lanes that frequently change and have much lower volumes. These are exactly the same factors that have rendered SAC rate cases impractical for carload shippers in contrast to unit train shippers. In addition, the one lump presumption requires shippers to rebut it for individual movements, and it requires evidence based on current or past experience. To account for future movements is impractical, if not impossible. And if UP and BNSF are correct about the broader impacts of vertical combinations than previously assumed, the inequity of requiring carload shippers to rebut the one lump presumption for every movement is exacerbated. Third, the one lump presumption only considers the impact of a merger upon rates, while ignoring any service impacts. Although applicants have promised to preserve the interline alternative by keeping the gateways open both physically and commercially, there is no objective measure to hold them to their promise to maintain commercially viable gateways. Therefore, the joint associations have proposed their own measure. I note at the outset that UP and BNSF also have offered their own proposals. Indeed, the UP proposal is very similar to our own. All 3 proposals offer a reasonable means to determine whether a gateway remains open commercially post-merger. Our proposal would set a rate for the applicant's bottleneck segment to or from the gateways for any movement for which the merger of the applicants creates the opportunity for a longer haul on their combined network than either applicant would have by itself. The diagram on the screen illustrates how our requested condition would establish a bottleneck rate. It is critical to note that this condition starts with whatever rate the applicants establish for their long-haul route. They have complete rate-setting freedom. The only constraint on the long-haul rate is the current statutory rate reasonableness constraint. The per-mile long-haul rate is then multiplied by the distance of the bottleneck segment to get a gateway rate that can be used on the interline movement. Now, the joint associations have a second request for conditions to mitigate merger-related service disruptions. Whether or not such disruptions are likely to occur is outside of the shipper control, but it is shippers who will suffer the most extensive harm. This fact has been demonstrated most significantly in the mergers of UPSP in 1995 and the division of Conrail in 2000. Although we are not predicting a recurrence of those scenarios, there are ample aspects of this transaction to establish sufficient reasons to be cautious. The extensive trackage rights over which KCS operates along the Gulf Coast requires careful coordination with the track owner, UP, and the co-tenant BNSF. Both of those railroads have raised concerns in this proceeding that the applicants are projecting additional traffic over those lines without additional infrastructure. The Joint Association members remember all too well how Houston became the epicenter of the UPSP service meltdown in 1995, and they are concerned that not be allowed to happen in this case, while UP, BNSF, and applicants toss around like a hot potato responsibility for the necessary infrastructure investments. Therefore, the joint associations have requested conditions that are modeled upon an agreement between CN and Knit League that was part of CN's acquisition of the Wisconsin Central. The 5 pillars in the applicant's service promises are fine aspirational promises, but they are meaningless without substantive provisions for enforcement and remedies. The Joint Association's third and final requested condition would prevent the applicants from extending CP's TIH liability, indemnity, and insurance tariff requirements to post-merger TIH movements over the pre-merger KCS network. The Joint Association's members, some of whom have submitted comments on this very subject, are concerned that post-merger CP will impose its more onerous tariff upon movements that currently are governed by the KCS tariff. Applicants have objected to this request on 3 grounds. First, they contend that the conditions would not truly address any impact of the transaction, because nothing would prevent KCS from choosing to adopt terms that mirror those in CP's public tariffs. But that is beside the point. KCS has not expressed any such desire or intent. It is solely because of this transaction that the CP tariff will be extended over the KCS network. Second, the applicants contend that the condition would in substance freeze KCS tariff terms permanently in their pre-transaction state, which would prevent the applicants from adapting to changes in conditions bearing on the risk profile of TIH shipments on the CP KC network. This concern can be easily addressed by allowing applicants to petition the board for permission to modify the KCS tariff terms upon demonstrating a material change to the risk profile of TIH shipments on the combined network from conditions existing immediately preceding the merger application. The burden of proof would be on the applicants to make that showing. And finally, the applicants complain that TIH shippers already have the right to challenge the reasonableness of the CP tariff terms, which is a right that will continue to exist post-merger, and that the requested condition would supplant that process with a per se rule of invalidity applicable uniquely to the applicants. Again, that is beside the point. But for this merger, there would be no need to challenge the CP tariff's applicability to TIH movements over the pre-merger KCS network. That is an unreasonable burden that applicants would impose upon TIH shippers as a cost of the applicant's desire to merge. CP is expressly on the record as saying it would not transport TIH materials but for its common carrier obligation. Thus, there is no reason to believe that TIH shippers will realize most of the merger benefits that the applicants have promised. Instead, those shippers are facing the prospect of more costs or abandoning markets currently served by the KCS. I thank you all for your time. That covers the 3 conditions. I'm happy to receive any questions you may have.
Does anybody have questions for Jeff?
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
Hi, Jeff. I wondered if you could just maybe speak to a little bit of the differences between the CP indemnification terms and the KCS terms. And I'm certainly not expecting for you to regurgitate contractual language or anything like that, but just what are the 30,000 foot differences, if you will?
Yeah, the CP terms require indemnification of CP for every potential cause of loss except for CP's own negligence. In addition, CP has a $100 million insurance procurement requirement on there. Whereas the KCS tariff does not have any insurance requirement. And the KCS tariff is more of each party is responsible for its own negligence, and the shipper is not made responsible for acts of God or third-party negligence, where CP does make the shipper responsible for those.
I guess just one more question. With regard to that level of additional insurance to the tune of 100 million, do you know of any members that might have difficulty obtaining that level of insurance, or is that not a concern?
It really depends upon the individual company and the size of the company. But other than that, I can't say a member would not necessarily. In many cases, these are negotiated out in contracts. There are, and to the extent that the parties can agree, in some contracts, the railroad will allow the member to self-insure. But it's entirely at the discretion of CP.
Thanks, Jeff.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Looking at your chart, this assumes that both CN and CP are serving the same destination. But if KCS has customers that are electing CN because they go to a different destination, or they're more direct, or for some other reason, if KCS sought to foreclose CN at the gateway, wouldn't they run the risk of a net loss of customers?
Say, would CP run the risk of a net loss of customers? Is that
No, well,
question?
the combined KCS-CP would run the risk of a net loss of customers on the former KCS segment. They might go to trucks or something else because the KCS-CP line wouldn't meet their requirements.
Well, frankly, the business might be lost altogether. I can't see it moving the trucks in most cases, because, for example, most shipments originating in KCS are going to be in the southern United States, and those terminating in Canada are going to be much further north of the border. So trucks aren't really going to be a viable option. If anything, the shipper may choose not to ship to that market at all.
But that results in loss of business for the combined KCS-CP.
If the shipper's unwilling to ship on the KCS-CP single line route, that would be the case. I can't think of a lot of situations where that would be the case. However, I think the shipper would just end up being forced to use the single line route and will no longer have the competitive constraint that the CN interline option currently provides.
Thank you.
Jeff, I'm wondering if you could specifically distinguish your bottleneck rate from the one proposed by BN and UP. Is it the same concept?
Compared to the one proposed by UP, they're nearly identical. There's a much more significant differences from the one proposed by BN. we could support any one of those. We believe the BN proposal, the I-5 prop rate, would be administratively far more complex to apply because BN is only proposing application of its proposal on Laredo cross-border traffic, whereas we're seeking to apply, we and UP are seeking to apply this to all gateways where there are extended bottlenecks, where the merger would extend the bottleneck. So trying to apply the I-5 prop rate proposal that Vienna has had to all of those possible gateways would be administratively more complicated than applying the UP proposal or our proposal. They all have the common trait that they are mileage prorated proposals. So however you get to in our case and the UP case, the starting point is the UP single line rate quote. You then determine on a mileage basis what the per mile rate would be, and then apply that to the miles to the gateway to get the gateway rate in our proposal, a commercially reasonable gateway rate.
So doesn't the math work out the same, whichever formula you use? It's just which.
The math would work out the same. Yeah, the key difference between our proposal and BNSF is what is the base starting proposal. BNSF is using some aggregation or an average of a collection of rates, whereas we are basing ours simply on the rate, the single line rate the applicants have proposed for the specific movement for which we're calculating a gateway rate.
Wait, run that past me again.
Let me try the next slide and see if that helps here. This is a mileage prorate illustration that actually comes from one of the applicant's reply. This is their illustration to try to argue that our proposal constitutes a tax, but I think it also will help address your question. Let's say, using this rate that, let's use column D as in dog. Post-merger, the single line rate on on CPKC will be $2,400. The total miles of that route are 3,000 miles. So you calculate that on a per mile basis, you divide row 2 divided by row 5, and you multiply that by the miles in row 6. And that gives you the bottleneck rate division of $800 in this example. That's all there is to it. You know what the applicant's single line rate is at $2,400. You apply the math and you come up with the $800.
Well, it's basically a straight prorata. It results in a prorata. The bottleneck is 1/3 of the mileage, so they pay 1/3 of the rate.
Yes, that's exactly how it's intended to work. And that's how the UP proposal works as well.
And
but it's by pegging it to the market rate of the single line route, we are trying to keep the a market-based bottleneck rate as well.
is it I take it your contention is, in part at least, that this is a way to calculate a rate that's sort of very objective and not open to challenge. It's just pure math.
Yes, it's very objective. It's simple to apply, so it can be applied on a broad-based basis. And I think it's important to keep in mind here, the purpose of this remedy is to preserve a viable interline competitive option to constrain the applicant's ability to exploit their extended bottlenecks resulting from the merger.
But other than simplicity of arithmetic, what's the economic justification for this division as opposed to some other division?
This division is pegged to the actual market rate that the applicants use for their single line movement. Now, so that and then applying this on a per mileage basis, you ensure that the applicants cannot set a bottleneck division that is so high as to allow them to make that interline option unviable and therefore no longer a constraint upon the applicant's single line option. Without that competitive threat from the interline option, the applicants can use their newfound single line market power to exploit that to set higher rates on the single line route than otherwise would be permissible.
But accepting the notion that there has to be some limitation in terms of the bottleneck concept so that there's no exploitation, and the applicants talk about rates that are commercially reasonable. What is the economic rationale for dividing the rate this way? In other words, an argument I've heard is that you don't spread the costs out evenly over the infrastructure that's being used this way, that there's a lot more proportionally infrastructure on the shorter portion of the haul. And the costs don't have as many miles to be spread out. So this doesn't make as much, doesn't have as much economic justification. How do you respond to that?
Well, keeping in mind that the purpose of the mileage prorate is to preserve a viable interline competitive constraint on the applicant's single line service. I think we need to keep in mind that if the applicants are truly creating a more efficient routing as a result of this merger, the interline option is unlikely to ever be used, except where that route is indeed the more efficient route, which is going to be the exception, not the rule here. By using this formula to keep the viable interline option rate available, this constrains the pricing on the single line rate that the applicants will have. This is akin to the competition that, for example, that shippers are seeking through reciprocal switching. The expectation in reciprocal switching is not that most of that traffic will actually be switched to the competing railroad. Rather, it's that the fact that the competitive threat from the reciprocal switch will discipline the incumbent railroad's behavior. Here, preserving the viability of the interline option from a pricing perspective also acts as to discipline the the long-haul railroad's behavior post-merger.
The question I'm asking is, I'm accepting, at least for this question, the importance of preserving the option and having the option being a force that keeps the rates in line. It just strikes me that this isn't the only mechanism to do that, the only way to calculate the rate. It is a approach that has an appeal for its simplicity and lack of debate, because the number is simply pro rata. But have you explored any other mechanism to figure out a way to divide up the rate so that it has the same effect?
Yes, I mean, given the discussion that I heard among the panelists last week, there seemed to be some concern that by the board members that the mileage prorate does not always reflect the pre-merger division of the rate between the two interline carriers. And that, for example, in this example, where the mileage is the gateway miles are 1/3 of the total miles, yet the pre-merger division is greater than 1/3. So if you wanted, you could simply freeze the pre-merger division ratios. That has a more complicated implementation, however, because if you do that, knowledge of those ratios will, depending on the circumstances, lie solely with either the railroad or with the shipper, depending on how the pre-merger rate was established. So that's going to almost guarantee some form of litigation will be required every time one wants to assess the commercial reasonableness using that proposal. So I'll take, to illustrate the problem, if the pre-merger rate is a joint rate, which is set by the origin carrier who then negotiates divisions with the connecting carrier, only that origin carrier is going to know what proportion its division constituted pre-merger. Or on the flip side, if the through rate were a combination of Rule 11 rates, the shipper will have negotiated those with the two individual carriers separately, and only that shipper is going to know what the proportionality was. So if you're going to freeze the pre-merger proportions, then there has to be some mechanism by which both parties to the transaction post-merger are going to be able to obtain the information they need to know what that proportionality is. And neither is going to have that ability without first bringing a case and obtaining discovery. So I think it becomes a recipe for overloading the STB system with unnecessary litigation.
Is that the only way? Those are the only two options you can think of in terms of measuring what's a rate that keeps the bottleneck open?
Yeah, I mean, the only other option that has ever even been thrown out there was the notion that you have a rate reasonableness case. But as you discussed last week, rate reasonableness and commercially open are not necessarily one and the same thing. And frankly, bringing a rate case is even less palatable than what I just described is associated with freezing the current divisions.
All right. Well,
let me offer one other thing here. It's a variation of the mileage prorate, and it's something that was used in SAC cases before the average total cost method was adopted. And that was what was called the modified mileage prorate, where the movement was broken into blocks of 100 miles each, and the originating carrier and the terminating carrier and the interchanging carriers got additional pieces of that block to count for their additional costs of handling the traffic at an origin or destination. So that's another option the STB could rely upon that it has used in past cases.
All right. Well, I would invite you, as I have the others, in your final briefing, if there are other mechanisms available for us to consider, assuming we were going to accept the idea that it was important to put some, obviously the applicants have said they will keep the bottlenecks open on commercially reasonable rates. And I appreciate, the practicality involved in measuring that. But if you have more thought on how to deal with this other than the strict proportional rate, and I'm not saying that's acceptable or not, but I'd like to know if there are any other alternatives. If you'll have the chance to do that in the final briefs. Patrick has a question for you.
Thank you. So Jeff, following up on Marty's question about differences between BN, UP, and shippers, fair to say that in comparison to BN, your mechanism would apply to different categories of traffic? In other words, are you proposing that it only apply to carload traffic?
I guess I'm a little confused by the question. To cargo traffic as opposed to
Carload.
Oh, carload traffic. Our members ship primarily in carloads, so that's our concern, and we do think that there is a unique problem when it comes to carload traffic, rebutting the one lump presumption. We are not proposing that unit train traffic be ineligible to use this, but our members are principally concerned with the carload side of the equation.
Would it only apply to jointly served areas today, including jointly served as you described via interswitching?
It would apply to any gateway where the merger of CP and KCS extends the length of haul of the applicant's post-merger.
Is that your way of trying to exclude kind of traffic patterns that were in a pre-merger state?
Correct. This is our way of trying to ensure that this condition only applies to an issue created by the merger.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you saw on Wednesday, there were a number of requests for clarification about what CPKC's Open Gateway Pledge applies to, including, whether or not they're short line carriers or whether or not applied to, interswitching and the like. Separating out the kind of the proportional rate mechanism, are there other aspects of their commitment to quote rates that you think deserve more clarity?
Yeah, I can't think of an issue that requires greater clarity. Our main concern was just making sure there's a objective, enforceable remedy.
Okay. And then I guess switching to, your contentions and your filings about how the board should abandon its presumption. And I think, there's a kind of a memorable passage in your filing about, the board has claimed that its experience in this area deserves the presumption, but you're not sure what experience that is. And I guess I'm wondering, can you point to some examples in past mergers that you would hold up as what the board should examine in terms of past vertical foreclosure that defeats the board's previous one lump presumption?
Well, in past mergers, the only attempts to defeat the one lump presumption were made by unit train coal shippers. And as a result, I think a lot of the points they were arguing are still the valid points to be made here. And that is the absence, for example, the absence of perfect information is one of those points. And when a shipper gets Rule 11 rates from the interline carriers, the bottleneck carrier does not have all the information it needs over the downstream carrier to set its pricing to extract that full one lump. And as I think UP's witness, Professor Salop, demonstrated through various analyses, that lack of information does allow benefits from competition to flow through. But he also demonstrated that it will vary significantly from shipper to shipper, from commodity to commodity. And the problem I have with the one lump theory as a presumption is that it simply presumes that there is no loss of competition for all traffic. Whereas I believe Professor Salop demonstrates that the loss of competition can be much more widespread, and it's not so easily predictable as can be that can simply be rebutted by individual shippers and individual moves. And when you're looking at a carload shipper who's coming in and doesn't have the volume of a unit train shipper, you're essentially requiring that carload shipper to come into the board in a merger with every possible origin destination combination and try to prove that it was getting the benefits of competition prior to the merger and that it will lose the benefits of that competition post-merger. That's a Herculean task, and it's one that no shipper is going to undertake because the cost-benefit assessment there just doesn't make sense.
Right, but I guess now we have the benefit of hindsight in these mergers. And I understand your point that it is difficult to disentangle, the effects. But aren't there gateways that and movements that you can hold up as examples of a merger causing vertical foreclosure?
There may be. I frankly don't have the data. I'm not sure who does or how, and some extensive analysis would probably have to be done. And that data would have to be obtained from the carriers who were involved in those mergers. And given that those mergers were 2 decades ago, I think there's a significant question as to whether that data even exists.
Well, what I'm struggling with is, because you're right, there was extensive analyses from the carriers presented, and you all present your detailed views as well. But what I'm struggling with is, I didn't hear from the carriers, they said one lump is outdated thinking. Well, if it's outdated thinking, then the thinking would have been outdated when it was applied to previous board actions, right? And, every shipper situation is different, and there are some instances where the thinking might hold up, and there may be some that it doesn't, but I'm yet to hear someone come forward with an example of where it didn't. I didn't hear from any of the carriers that, hey, here's where we vertically foreclosed a gateway, and so I was hoping that you might be able to, and it's not just to empirically verify the claim for the sake of validating your arguments. It's also for to advance potential oversight that the board could engage in, telltale signs that there's vertical foreclosure going on. And so it basically serves a joint purpose. So having kind of those concrete examples, I think would at least, along with the metrics that demonstrate that, or the data that demonstrate that, I think would be useful.
I hear what you're saying. I think I agree completely that it would be useful. I'm just not sure how we can ever generate that data 2 decades after the fact.
Understood.
Mr. Fuchs?
Yes.
McBride, I wonder, even though I haven't made my affirmative argument yet, if I could give you an example that answers the question I think you were just asking?
That'd be great.
So I want to go back. And by the way, I'm one of the guilty parties who represented the coal shippers in challenging the one lump theory. So I'm being consistent across the decades here. But in UP-CNW, a merger most people don't talk about very much, about which preceded the UP-SP merger, UP-CNW was about as classically a vertical merger as you could conceive of, right? Direct line from the UP to Council Bluffs, and then another direct line from Council Bluffs to Chicago, which was the CNW. And prior to the UP-CNW merger, CNW was indifferent as to whether UP or BNSF brought coal to Council Bluffs to then be transshipped on CNW up to the Sargent plant of the utility in Iowa at the time. It's called the Sargent, it's at Sargent Bluff, Iowa. And it's about 90 miles north of Council Bluffs. And so that shipper, that utility, had head-to-head competition between UP and BNSF prior to the UP-CNW merger. Once that merger was concluded, UP-CNW foreclosed BNSF from being a competitor to transport coal to that Sargent plant.
That's a helpful example. Now, do you have any concerns, Mike, that if there are indeed and whether or not that example, continues with changes in markets and other things is, I don't want to hold it up as something that's, necessarily ongoing today without knowing more about the situation. Do you have any concerns? Again, this might not necessarily be a concern for a particular shipper who is directly affected by CPKC, but do you have any concerns about applying a bottleneck rule to just one carrier when other carriers might have engaged in those practices? In other words, do you have any concerns just from from the board's perspective? Again, you might have a shipper on the CPKC that, is concerned with their lot, and that is understandable, but with applying a regulatory regime just to one carrier?
Well, I don't want to intrude on Jeff's time too much here, so I'll invite him to speak to this too, but
that would be good.
I don't have any concern for a couple of reasons. First of all, the applicants have said that they will accept any administratively final conditions that you adopt. Second, they seem to concede that this vertical foreclosure issue is a real issue. They have a different remedy. They would have us file rate cases at the board, which, by the way, is ironic because they accuse us of re-regulation at page 109 of their reply comments, when it's they who are advocating endlessly complicated regulatory proceedings as a remedy. But this is a response to a particular merger which presents particular foreclosure issues, especially between CP and CN in Canada because of interswitching. And so I think, and then you heard a lot about Mexico, of course, which I won't go back into, but there's some unique issues in this merger. And when I get to my affirmative presentation, I'll tell you a little more, but I can tell you now that FERC confronted this same problem 25 or 30 years ago, as you may know, when it was trying to separate the pipelines from the gas production function. And it adopted an affiliate trading rule to bar the pipelines from favoring their affiliates. And discrimination is a concept that's alive and well at FERC, even though it hasn't been applied by the ICC or the board for a long time. But as you heard in Mexico, for example, the Mexican government has an anti-discriminatory principle. So if the rates have to all be the same in Mexico, then what CPKC could do would be to vertically foreclose competitors in the US by allocating internally, the costs, as BN explained to you, I think, on an overall joint rate. So if they're quoting today $2,000 to go to a destination on UP off KCS or a destination on CP, also $2,000. And then after the merger, CPKC raises the rates in Mexico to $1,200 from $1,000. And internally sets its own rate, at $800. So it's still collecting $2,000. Then UP is either going to have to reduce its rate to $800 or lose the business. And that's the kind of affiliate discrimination that FERC prohibits. And it's a model that I think you should find very instructive. It's worked very, very well in the pipeline industry to prevent this kind of discrimination that I think the joint shippers, my client has adopted Jeff's joint shipper comments, UP and BN have all said is a very real problem here. And our proposal, by the way, would also avoid getting into the internal divisions. You, the board, not you personally, but the board fought me off in the Conrail case. I was using a witness by the name of Alfred Kahn, and he testified that he needed the internal costing data of the applicants in order to demonstrate the problems with the one lump theory. The administrative law judge granted my discovery request to get that. The one and only time I think in the history of ICC and STB merger cases, at least that I've been in over the last several decades, the board overturned that ruling by the ALJ and would not allow us to get into the internal costing. And you generally have been reluctant to do that. And so once again, I think our proposal avoids that problem. The applicant's proposal would launch you squarely into that internal costing problem.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think Mike's perspective is very helpful because it goes back even to before I was in law school. But the one point he does make that I think is most distinguishing of this merger from nearly all other mergers is Canadian interswitching. The fact that most origins or destinations in Canada are going to have access to two rail carriers by virtue of interswitching makes the scope of this harm so much broader than other transactions. The one and only other transaction I can think of that would even be comparable to this would have been the CNIC merger. Otherwise, I think this is very different from BNSF, UPSP, Conrail, et cetera.
This is very, very helpful. One other question on this point, and I got a couple others on different points. You all seem to put forward that after the board sets a framework on proportional rates, that the proportional rate be enforced by arbitration. Could you maybe, is that right? And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, we put in a provision that if there should be a dispute between the parties in the calculation of this proportional rate, that it would be resolved by arbitration. Frankly, because of the mathematical nature of the calculation, I find it very difficult to conceive of any dispute arising, but we thought it just practical to have one just in case something we didn't foresee.
I gotcha. Okay, switching gears a couple on your two other points, Jeff. First is service oversight. What do you think is your top specific priority that isn't in the CPKC pledge? Understand that they have kind of broad goals as you describe it. What is your top specific aspect of service oversight that you think is thus far unaddressed?
Well, we developed our request for oversight conditions based upon an agreement between CN and Knit League in the CN Wisconsin Central merger. And we did this, we basically adopted it wholesale with just two modifications. Now, the applicants haven't said whether they would agree to the CNWC concept, but they have specifically objected to the two modifications that we had. First, they objected to our request to provide shippers with at least 30 days prior written notice of any planned service changes at shipper facilities. And they objected to that because it would inject operational rigidity and undermine CPKC's ability to compete effectively. I think the applicants have misunderstood the scope of that request to change, because this condition merely requires the courtesy of providing 30 days notice of any planned service changes at shipper facilities, not anywhere else in the network, but to the shipper facility itself. A 30-day notice requirement for such operational changes that can have such dramatic effects upon a shipper's operations seems to be eminently reasonable, and applicants have not explained why or how they would be harmed if they had to provide, could not implement those changes on less than 30 days notice. The second change that we made to which applicants object is probably more substantive, because it adds teeth to the CNWC agreement that previously did not exist. The applicants specifically have objected to a proposed service remedy if the shipper's average monthly transit time is adversely affected by the transaction for more than 30 days after the shipper notifies CP of that effect. In the CNWC agreement, there was a permissive provision that CN and each individual shipper were to negotiate a sliding scale of charges based on CP's post-transaction performance for a shipper relative to the base service levels. That was totally permissive, so it wasn't really a condition with any particular teeth. We're proposing to make it mandatory. And we think it's appropriate to do so here, even though it was not done in CNWC, because this is a major transaction. CNWC was a significant transaction. And ultimately, a permissive condition is really no condition at all. And so I think that kind of, those are really the two main points of contention that I believe we have with the applicants with respect to our conditions, because the applicants don't really object to the other conditions that are associated with the CNWC agreement.
Very helpful. Thank you. And then I might defer my question on the liability provision, because I suspect Mike's going to get into it in some detail. But I might, Jeff, circle back with you on that.
Sounds good. I'll still be here.
All right. Any other questions for Jeff? Okay. Michael.
Thank you.
You're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I hope you can hear me all right. And I very much welcome Jeff remaining on. I think we serve well as a panel. Let me first go to the last subject that Jeff addressed affirmatively, and that's this hazmat tariff issue, which some of the board members have already asked about. First of all, this is a merger-related issue because KCS has not changed its tariff language, but as Dr. Major testified, it is expected that combined CPKC would do so. So, and second, it's evident that KCS wants to compete for hazmat, including chlorine, whereas CP does not. And the Bayer testimony, which is still part of the record, and which my client, the Chlorine Institute, adopted and incorporated by reference in its amended comments on June 9th, reflects the fact that Olin, which is the largest chlorine producer in North America, and Oxy, which is either second or third, and together they produce over 60% of the total chlorine supply in the US, will not ship to Bayer's facility at Muscatine, Iowa on the CP lines because of the CP tariff, but are more than willing to ship to Bayer's facility in Kansas City, Missouri on the KCS lines, solely because of this tariff language problem. So this is really an anti-competitive issue and is precisely the sort of thing that you are supposed to ameliorate to preserve existing competition. CP, as Jeff, I think, noted, but I want to emphasize, said in the UP petition for declaratory order docket FD 35504 that it would not carry hazardous material but for the common carrier obligation. So we know what CP is doing here. CP is using its tariff language to avoid having to carry hazmat in contravention of its common carrier obligation. That's the long and short of it. They have a history, obviously, because of the terrible tragedy up at Lac-Mégantic. There was another railroad that delivered, but I think the crude oil originated on CP, and CP, is concerned about carrying hazardous material, but the fact of the matter is that they have to do so. And so we would ask you to order the applicants, if they're going to have one tariff, as apparently they say they will, according to Dr. Major, to use the KCS tariff language or words to that effect. As Jeff said, if they want to petition to make some changes, they can petition to do so, and to do that on all the traffic. And to address a point that Vice Chairman Schultz asked about, Jeff answered the question about differences between CP and KCS. I refer you, Board Member Schultz, to the Agrium complaint in NOR 42145, which recites a litany of problems with the CP tariff language. And I want to close on this issue and then move to two more by reminding you that in 1977, in the radioactive materials litigation, your predecessor, the ICC, held that railroads had to carry hazardous materials, in that case, radioactive materials, because among other reasons, the rail mode is the safest mode for the transportation of hazardous materials. And we want you to keep it that way. And so we would ask you to order the merger parties, if their merger is approved, to use tariff language that is pro-competitive, not anti-competitive. Let me move to this representations issue briefly. It turns out, Mr. Chairman, that the board frankly deviated from its prior policy on this issue in the recent CSX Pan Am merger by only holding the merger applicants to their on-the-record representations. In the UPSP merger, the STB ordered UP to abide by all of its representations. That's in decision number 44, 1 STB 246 at note 14. And we know it's all the representations, even though the word all doesn't appear there, just says held to its representations. Because subsequently in that docket, in finance docket 32760 and decisions 106 and 107, G3 Enterprises and BNSF jointly petitioned for enforcement of a representation that UP made that they felt UP was now not abiding by. And the board entertained that petition, even though the representation was off the record, if you will, not on the record. So, and off the record and on the record representations really are the same in terms of the effect that they have on people who may stay out of a proceeding because of a representation. You should allow those people to come in, even if it's years from now, and say, wait a minute, the applicants told me they wouldn't do such and such to me. You know, they would continue to switch, or they wouldn't foreclose me at that interchange, or whatever it may be. And so I didn't come in here and participate because of that representation, and now they're violating it. You really, I think, owe it to such parties to be open, just as you were to G3 Enterprises and BNSF and UPSP. And finally, quickly on this competitive interchange issue, I hope that you require the applicants to provide a list of all interchanges that either CP or KCS now have with other railroads, and to make whatever condition you adopt apply at such interchanges. As I was saying in the answer to some of the questions, you should not allow them to favor their affiliate or themselves, if you will, just as FERC does not do. And I don't think you want to get into endlessly regulating these so-called bottleneck rates, or whatever you want to call them, Mr. Chairman, which is what CP and KC ironically would require you to do. Whereas what we're suggesting, and I think you heard BN say it, that when BN wants to quote a shipper a rate under their prop rate agreement with UP, they just quote the rate. They don't even have to call up UP. That's a commercial solution to the problem. That's a perfectly administratively simple approach. As Jeff said, I don't even think it would lead to any disputes before the board, because I don't think there ever has been one brought to the board under the UP BNSF prop rate agreement. It's practical, and I would urge you, as I think Board Member Fuchs alluded to last week at one point, not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We can quibble around the margins about whether this is perfect, but our proposal, I think, is vastly superior to a re-regulatory approach like that the applicants are advocating. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll close, except I want to just add one other thing. You expressed some concern that the shippers might be somehow offended that they were pushed off a few days in the hearing. And I want to assure you that we took no offense whatsoever. We were happy to accommodate the board and you and all your staff on whatever schedule worked for you. So thank you very much for allowing us to appear today.
Well, I appreciate that, Michael. And I was hoping that all the participants would understand that we were trying to juggle complex logistics and weren't trying to favor or not favor any particular stakeholder. A couple of questions.
Sure.
On the question of having these whatever rules apply to all gateways or all exchanges, you know, I asked the other railroads not to rely on CP KCS, but to provide us with a list of every gateway they were aware of. And
Right.
I would say the same to the shippers. So you don't have to rely on CP KCS getting it right intentionally or unintentionally. So at least as far as your clients are concerned, it's up to you, Jeff, to all shippers. if you want to make sure some gateway is brought to our attention or interchange, I think the applicants went further and said any place where there's an interchange, we would apply this promise to. Make sure we have a complete list. I'd rather, if we're going to do this, I'd rather define it with precision up front rather than argue 10 years from now whether something was a gateway.
Yeah, I don't have such a list, but there may be consultants who do. So we'll take that under advisement. I think the railroads obviously have the best information on this. And if UP and BN and Norfolk Southern will provide, and CN will provide these interchanges, that might be the most efficient way to do it.
Well, I thought so. I'm sorry.
Well,
Jeff?
Mr. Chairman, I would just add, I think the definition that we have proposed avoids even needing to develop a list. If the applicants get a longer haul as a result of the merger than they had pre-merger, then whatever interchange they went over that grants that longer haul, by definition, becomes applicable or subject to this condition.
That may be right. I'm just in the interest of minimizing definitions and disputes. People should feel free to make sure we have everything they think should be covered. Michael, one other question I had for you is, I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to in an off-the-record representation.
Sure.
How would such a representation come into existence?
Sure. Great question. If you go back and look at decision number 106 and decision number 107 in the UPSP docket, finance docket 32760, what happened there is a railroad that you may recall came back to the board on another matter relatively recently called the MET, or the Modesto and Electric Traction Railroad, I think is the name of it. And their president wrote to the president of UP while the UPSP merger was pending, and said that he had heard a lot of concerns that a combined UPSP was going to foreclose switching in the MET switching district in and around Modesto. And that was a private letter off the record. And he got an off the record reply from a VP of UP saying, oh no, we're not going to do that. And then several years later, when G3 Enterprises sought to have BN provide service to it through switching on the MET, UP suddenly said, we're not going to abide by that. Now, in fairness to UP, the letter back from UP referred to companies by name, including Procter & Gamble. And the Procter & Gamble facility was sold to G3. And that's where G3 thought it had the rights to switch at the same facility. And UP took the position that the representation was limited to the name of the company. The merits of that dispute are not what's so critical. The point is, Mr. Chairman, that was an off-the-record representation made by UP that G3 and BNSF later sought to enforce before the board. And the board had no difficulty whatsoever in entertaining the pleadings on that dispute, held oral argument about it, and resolved it on the merits, and didn't say, oh, that was off the record, so you're not entitled to come in here and seek relief.
My recollection, don't hold me to this, I don't have the Pan Am decision in front of me, is that we didn't qualify where the representations were made. We said something about all representations, as I recall, but maybe it's the lawyer and not the railroader in me, but I am troubled by generating litigation decades from now about something that's so-called off the record. I would think if any stakeholder, shipper, short line, anybody, or other railroad has a representation that's been made to them that has led them to either not oppose or be comfortable with this transaction, they should put it on the record so there isn't, so we don't generate unnecessary litigation in the future, or we don't have the kind of definitional problems, Michael, that you're talking about, because it sounds to me like what led to that dispute was a letter that was written by two laymen and not by a lawyer anticipating future name changes or corporate transactions and so forth. So I would prefer, I'm not prejudging how we might write a decision here if we approve the merger, that anybody who's relying on anything, let's get it out front. Because also it could relate to our view the public interest and so forth.
Well, I hear you. First of all, I actually argued this same point in the CSX Pan Am merger. I argued for, treating on the record and off the record representations the same. And as I read your decision, you limited the condition to on the record representations. And I think
You may be right. I don't remember debating this issue in that case. Or anybody bringing it to our attention. Maybe you did, and I somehow was asleep at the switch. I don't recall, but it just, that's why we have a record, so everybody knows what everybody said, what they promised.
Well, I think if you go back and look at your decision there in the CSX Pan Am case, you'll see in the appendix where you summarize parties' positions that I did in fact make the argument that it should apply to both on the record and off the record. The board acknowledged that. But in the decision itself, it appears limited to only on the record. And maybe it's shame on me, Mr. Chairman, because I didn't ask for argument time in CSX Pan Am. But I thought, among other things, because of this issue and because this is a departure from what the board did in UPSP, as I indicated earlier in decision number 44, 1 STB at 246 note 14, I think you really need to confront the fact that you have two lines of precedent now. And finally, on your point, Mr. Chairman, that you would prefer everybody to come in and be on the record about these things. I understand, and if I were in your position, I might, see the temptation, but the fact of the matter is, Mr. Chairman, that there are a lot of people out there who do not want to raise their head and come to the STB if they don't feel they have to. And if they get a letter from a vice president of a class 1 railroad that says, don't worry, we're not going to foreclose switching in Modesto, they think they can rely on that. And those kinds of representations get made all the time in this business. And very well, I think, Mr. Chairman, you've heard it from a lot of shippers. They just don't want to have to make a litigation matter or raise a dispute at the board if they don't feel it's necessary. So I think that's the unfortunate reality, is that people are reluctant to come to you until and unless they feel they have to.
Well, all I would say is, since I entered the railroad world at Metra some years ago, I have found it remarkable as a practicing attorney how many major economically important decisions rest on a handshake. And most of the time people are honorable and handshakes work. But if everybody was a saint, we wouldn't need you and me, right?
But at least you.
So, I just think it's better people put things on the record. But I hear what you're saying, and we'll take it up, assuming we get to that point in this case where we're talking about conditions. But it just troubles me to have some kind of open. For example, would an oral representation be something we'd hold people to? How would you ever prove it?
Well, that's the point.
Do we have to write out what kinds of off-the-record representations we'll enforce versus those we won't? Is email good enough? I mean, you get it just gets very murky, and my way of thinking as a lawyer.
I understand, but I think you're conflating two things. The last point you just made is about proof. What is sufficient for the shipper who wants to come in for relief or the other railroad to prove their case? In the case of G3 and BNSF that I mentioned to you, that litigated in decisions 106 and 107, they had the paper, they had the letters back and forth. There was no issue about what the representations were. If a shipper wants to do this orally, they take the chance they're never going to prove it. But the other thing you're conflating here, Mr. Chairman, I think, is that merger conditions are permanent. You have before you a dispute, for example, involving Valero, UP, BNSF, and KCS. I think somebody mentioned last week, generally referring to that it's been going on for more than 10 years. That's unfortunate, but the fact of the matter is these merger conditions are permanent. And whether it's on the record or off the record or whatever it may be, the doors have to remain open even decades from now to enforce these conditions.
Well, I'm not adverse to the notion of always trying to implement fairness and justice between conflicting parties. But there are rules, going back to the statute of frauds in England, where the question wasn't whether you could prove it. The question was whether everybody was protected in some way that prohibited people making phony claims or claims that might be meritorious, but you otherwise couldn't enforce. And of course, there are a million exceptions now to the statute of frauds, but the policy and the philosophy has been around our legal system for hundreds of years, and it just troubles me. As I said, it troubles the lawyer in me. Maybe I should think more like a railroader, but that's another subject that I actually should save for a different speech.
How about, let me just make this one last point. If you want to limit it to written representations, including emails instead of oral, that would be something you could think about, because at least you wouldn't have the proof problems.
But by the way, I understand that the reluctance, I've heard it repeatedly since I've gotten to the board, of shippers and other stakeholders to bring their problems to us for fear of retaliation. But if CP or KCS has sat down and said, we will make this representation to you, it's hard for me to imagine that they'd have trouble putting that in the record. Because if they wanted to penalize a shipper who got a promise for putting something in the record, that would lead me to think they had no intention of carrying it out.
Well, just like
so people should not be deterred, I would think, under these circumstances. They don't have to open up a separate litigation. They just have to inform us of this is a promise that was made to me, and that's why you haven't heard from me, or I'm not objecting, or I'm supporting it.
Well, look at it the other way, Mr. Chairman, and I hear you, but here's the situation that often comes up. Just like in the UPSP situation, when the president of the MET Railroad wrote to the president of UP apparently wanted to keep the correspondence off the record, because it probably didn't want to invite all kinds of disputes elsewhere on the system along the same lines. So it limited its representation to what the switching situation would be in Modesto. And I think that the applicants actually have an interest in not having all of their representations on the record for that reason.
Well, Marty?
Yep. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, no, just on this narrow on this point, just a narrow follow-up. One of the things that I struggle with, and I think you alluded to it, Marty, about our obligation to uphold the public interest, is that if we don't see the representation and we, in effect, order it, we don't really know if the representation is in the public interest. Some representations may well affect other shippers. It may well affect other entities. In a crazy hypothetical, imagine if applicants committed to a chlorine shipper that they will sideline Amtrak trains so the chlorine shipper can have better service. That might be something that the board might not agree with, especially given preference law, but yet we would in effect order such representation. Now, that's not the type of representation CPKC is giving, but that just, it's a hypothetical to say that some of these things can have effects on others. And I am a bit uncomfortable ordering things that I don't know the contents of. So I just want you to respond to that, Mike.
Well, yeah, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. And I would take you back to the UPSP situation. The applicants are not going to make some crazy representation, first of all, like I think you just acknowledged. But in any event, let's assume that there is some representation that you think is contrary to public policy. And it's off the record, and the president of XYZ railroad or shipper writes a letter, and they get a letter back or an email exchange, whatever it may be. And in years from now, the combined CPKC is not abiding by that. They would have to come in and petition to enforce the representation. And you would have it in your power to say, wait a minute, we weren't aware of this, and that's contrary to public policy, and we're not going to do that. So you get the final say in whether to grant a petition for enforcement. And so as I said earlier, the shipper or railroad would have to put on their proof. They would have the burden of proof. If they persuaded you that they proved the representation occurred, but it was contrary to public policy, then I think you'd be within your rights in saying we can't enforce that under the statute.
Michael, I have a real problem with that. I really do. We enter an order that says all representations must be enforced. 10 years from now, say, well, we changed our mind. We don't. Now that we know what it is, it may or may not be. That could be in the eye of the beholder. It isn't so obvious. Patrick puts forward a very good hypothetical, but there are limited number of permutations and combinations. I'm having a problem with it, but you know, I'll take a look at it for speaking for myself. I don't know about the other board members, but to say that we're going to enforce all representations and then saying no, but we're telling you it's not worth the paper or the promise it's written on because we may change our minds when you come in to enforce it. That doesn't strike me as advancing the cause. And you say that we don't expect people to make crazy promises. I no longer have confidence in the lack of craziness out there in the world based on what's been going on the last few years.
Well,
So to make open-ended commitments strikes me as a little risky.
Well, this is precisely what the board did do in UPSP, was to tell UPSP that they were going to have to abide by all their representations. And then a dispute arose over what the representation was, and G3 and BN lost. So, you know, if you want to qualify it by saying all representations that are consistent with the public, with the public good or public interest, do that. Because you are the final arbiter, and I have every confidence that the board will be fair if somebody comes before you and proves a representation. But if you decide it's not in the public interest, then just like other things people are asking you to do right now, you're not going to abide by if they're not in the public interest.
All right. Patrick, did you have anything further on this? I wanted to go
No,
back.
Marty, please. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I actually wanted to shift gears, Michael, if you don't mind. I had a question for Jeff, which I did not ask him about. Jeff, could you, we've had a lot of discussion about the Knit League agreement at the Tex-Mex acquisition, which is different, as I understand it, from what you're asking for now. Could you shed some light on what that agreement was in terms of the bottleneck and why it's not adequate at this point? Or why you think it's not adequate?
Jeff, you're on mute there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I am not personally familiar with the Tex-Mex agreement involving Knit League. I was not representing Knit League in that particular situation. I was not involved in the negotiations at that time. So I'm just afraid I can't answer your question.
All right, well, I would be interested, since you're the only person speaking for Knit League in these proceedings, I think. I don't think they've appeared on their own. Perhaps in your final briefing, you could ask Knit League to address that, because it's come up several times, and I'm not aware of Knit League coming in and regretting whatever agreement they made, or any of the other shippers who were relying on it. Maybe they do now, but I think it would be enlightening to the board to hear, you know, the pros and cons of that arrangement.
I will go back and consult with Karen Booth on that and see what we may have in the record.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions for Michael or Jeff?
I have one on the liability provision.
Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah. Kind of two parts. One is wondering if you can respond to the argument of that CP makes, which is, well, their provision hasn't been found illegal. Therefore, and I suspect you may say, well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's in the public interest, but I would like you to respond to it. But then the second part is, what does a public interest analysis even look like for such a provision?
So let me take a crack first, if that's all right with Jeff, and he can follow up. And that is, first of all, there's a history here, Board Member Fuchs, that you may be aware of. You seem to be aware of a lot of things, so I'll bet you're aware of this too. And that is in Finance Docket 677 and also in 677 sub 1. The railroad industry came to the board about 2007 or 8, following the Graniteville, South Carolina accident that, you know, in which some people lost their lives and lots of people were hospitalized, and said, we want you to give us the authority in our tariffs to be able to say we're not going to carry chlorine or anhydrous ammonia or whatever it is that they didn't want to carry. And they said it was because they could be facing a $5 billion liability in such an accident. That was the testimony before the board of the then General Counsel of UP. And needless to say, the chemical industry, as well as the coal industry and others, and why coal? Because we use chemicals for pollution control. We use anhydrous ammonia for that. And even use chlorine for water purification. So a lot of industries push back. Most notably, the American Chemistry Council, its president appeared, argued ferociously against allowing the railroads to do that, saying it would go back on the, unbroken law that requires the railroads under the common carrier obligation to carry and not to be able to pick and choose or foreclose what they'll carry in their tariffs. And then, so the board decided to close those proceedings without taking any action as the railroads had requested. Then UP in FD 35504 filed a petition for declaratory order for approval of some discrete tariff changes that it wanted to make, including with respect to insurance. And the board issued a merits decision, said, no, we're not going to grant that relief. And then that's when CP took matters into its own hands, took the law into its own hands, if you will, and adopted the tariff provisions that you now have before you. And Agrium filed a complaint, and the Agrium complaint in NOR 42145, as I recall, is a really thorough, comprehensive analysis of how illegal the CP tariff is. And CP and Agrium then settled, so the board didn't have to rule on the merits. But I would suggest to you, going back to my first cases involving the railroads about radioactive materials, the railroads have to carry hazardous materials that are tendered to them in compliance with all governmental obligations and regulations. As long as the shipper tenders the shipment in conformance with the provisions of FRA or PHMSA or whatever agency, including the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it may be, if the shipper's shipment is in compliance, the railroads have to carry. And what CP is doing here, quite obviously, is using this hazmat tariff to avoid its common carrier obligation, which KCS is not doing. So is it illegal? Yes, it is. It just hasn't been adjudicated precisely on the terms of this tariff yet. But all of the cases that I just recited to you, I think, line up to say they have a common carrier obligation and they're trying to evade it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would add, it's quite clear and from the board's precedent that Mike has referred to that TIH materials are critical for the public interest, and the transportation of TIH materials by rail is far more preferable than the alternative of transporting by truck from a public interest perspective. And we have testimony in this proceeding from shippers. I believe Oxy was one of them who pointed out that they won't ship to certain locations in CP. And now we're talking about expanding the impact of that CP tariff to the KCS lines and potentially impacting the ability and willingness to ship to an even broader section of the public in TIH materials. So I think there's and the fact that CP has specifically said it would not ship TIH materials, but for the common carrier obligation, certainly raises suspect their motives in their current tariff and the impacts that it is having on a competitive basis too, because the pro-competitive effects of this merger are not likely to be realized by TIH shippers. In fact, it's going to likely to be anti-competitive with respect to the TIH markets for that reason.
Yeah, and one other thing, Mr. Fuchs, yes, it's not only Oxy, but it's Olin that Jeff is referring to as companies who said they wouldn't ship. And I want to remind you that the Department of Agriculture and the Wheat Growers Association, among others, are also in support of our views on this.
So wondering if, and you all basically proposed to do the KCS tariff, right?
Yes.
Okay. Wondering if that locks CPKC into a structure that may well become outdated someday for whatever reason. I imagine that these tariffs don't stay constant over 30 years. and wondering if, I'm not urging or suggesting you all or CPKC, but I'm wondering how would you respond to changing market dynamics and whether or not that leads one to conclude that some sort of transition period would be more appropriate.
Well, I think Jeff already made mention of the fact that this tariff has been there for a while. And it was, I think, essentially the same tariff that Agrium complained about. So sometimes these tariffs do stay rather static, Mr. Fuchs, for the very reason that CP is trying to avoid carrying these materials so they don't feel a need to make any changes. But to take your question fairly and to say, okay, what if in the future something changed? Jeff also made the point, which I agree with, I just didn't repeat it, that let them come in and file a petition, just like UP did in Finance Docket 35504, or in this docket itself, and say, you know, the world has changed and we need to change our tariff, and here's why, and be very upfront about it and say, we're willing to carry these materials, but we need you to approve the following changes. You know, if there's an insurance requirement at all, it shouldn't be $100 million, but maybe it's $1 million or whatever it may be. And now maybe they come in 5 years from now and say it should be $2 million. You know, something like that. I think, you know, you should leave the door open to allow them to come in if they do claim circumstances have changed.
Thank you.
All right. Any further questions for these two witnesses? Michael and Jeff, as usual, you do a lot of homework, you enlighten us, and I much appreciate it. And as I said on the things we asked questions about, if you want to submit further ideas or argument in your final briefs, obviously that's why they're there.
Thank you very much for all the time and attention,
Yeah,
Mr. Chairman, members of the board.
Thank you.
thank you. All right. Surprisingly, that is the list of witnesses for today's session. We will recess until tomorrow morning at 9:30 Eastern on this same channel. And if I would say if Mayor Ellis from Monroe, Louisiana, who I know has been patiently trying to testify to us several different days, is available, we will certainly fit him into tomorrow's schedule whenever he's available. Otherwise, we will begin first thing with panel D, 9:30 Eastern. Thank you all. We will recess until then.
Thank you.